March 1942. The cold Siberian wind cut through the streets of Yakutsk as a man aged beyond his years stepped into the military recruitment office. Fyodor Oklopkov was not the kind of man the Red Army wanted. He was 52 years old, a licensed fur trapper who had spent more time in the wilderness than in human company. To the young officers, he was an anachronism, a relic of a forgotten time, but Fyodor carried something far more valuable than youth, a lifetime of precision, patience, and ruthless skill honed beneath the shadow of the taiga. The officers looked at him with quiet disbelief, dismissing him as unfit for the brutal front lines of the Great Patriotic War. But Fyodor was unyielding. He carried with him meticulous records of every shot he had ever fired, thousands of kills with an impossible first-shot accuracy. The bureaucrats scoffed, unwilling to bend rules written for younger men and faster guns. Days stretched into weeks. Fyodor refused to leave the recruiting hall, sitting silently with his worn Mosin Nagant rifle resting across his knees, waiting for proof to arrive that would turn doubt into respect. They sent inspectors to his village in the far north, held his records under scrutiny, spoke with fur traders and fellow hunters. When the reports came back, confirming his claims beyond doubt, the gates finally opened. Yet, the army's hesitation lingered. Age was a barrier more stubborn than any foe, and Fyodor was assigned to the lowest-ranked marksman company, a place where men too weak or clumsy for the front waited out their time in obscurity. But Fyodor would not accept their charity or grudging acceptance. He promised to turn the worst shooters into sharpshooters within a week, or to return home defeated. The officer who had dismissed him 3 weeks earlier found himself forced to watch a miracle. Soon, the army's worst marksmen doubled their accuracy, shaken from despair to deadly focus by Fyodor's quiet determination. Word spread through the regiment. An old hunter from Siberia was teaching men to shoot like demons. When the time came, he was sent not to a support role, but straight into the hell of the Stalingrad front, where life was cheap and death faster than a heartbeat. The men he traveled with saw the old man and whispered, "Dedushka," grandfather. But behind their doubts, a seed of hope had been planted. The city ahead was no longer a city, but a graveyard of broken buildings and shattered dreams. In this apocalypse, Fyodor's past became his greatest weapon. The frozen and unforgiving wilderness had prepared him for a war where patience was survival, and one perfect shot was the difference between life and death. As the first rays of dawn pierced the smoky horizon, he steadied his old rifle, ready to show the world that age was not a weakness, but a sharpened edge. The train rattled through the twilight as Fyodor sat alone in a cramped compartment, the weight of years pressing down on his broad shoulders. Outside, the landscape blurred from endless forests to scarred fields, and finally to the ruined outskirts of Stalingrad, the city where the fate of nations would be decided in blood and fire. Around him, younger soldiers joked nervously, trying to mask the fear that clung to the air like smoke. They looked at Fyodor with a mix of curiosity and pity, a man old enough to be their grandfather, carrying a rifle that had seen more winters than most of them had birthdays. When the regiment finally settled into their positions, the true horror swallowed them. The factory district they were assigned to was a lattice of shattered stone and steel where every shadow could be a death sentence. The air was thick with the stench of burning metal and despair. Soldiers moved like ghosts, wary of snipers perched unseen in the skeletons of buildings. Lieutenant Berezhkov was a man hardened by relentless losses, his face carved with lines of exhaustion and bitterness. When he first saw Fyodor, his skepticism was palpable. An old man on the front line was a liability, a burden no commander craved. He assigned Fyodor to a trench overlooked by a vast ruin where enemy snipers had claimed dozens of lives, men whose deaths had brought the young sharpshooter whispers of legend. "Don't look up. Don't move. Live long enough to fight another day," Yushin, the jittery young soldier assigned to guide him, warned. Their words were warnings born of the soil soaked with comrades' blood. But Fyodor felt none of their fear. In his time among wolves and frost, fear was a luxury that killed faster than bullets. As dawn unfolded, Fyodor took his position and melted into the crumbling wall. His eyes scanned the ruins with the patience of a shadow waiting for the sun to shift. Then, a flicker in the ruined ventilation shaft, the subtle movement barely perceptible to any but the most trained eye. He steadied his breathing, calibrated his aim with years of instinct rather than fancy optics, and waited. One perfect shot shattered the silence. Somewhere deep in the ruins, a German sniper fell. Another enemy lost in the growing tally of death that Fyodor was about to carve with slow precision. Around him, the whispers grew louder. Perhaps the old hunter would not be forgotten this time. The air in Stalingrad hung heavy with smoke and the bitter scent of destruction. Every shattered building, every twisted metal beam bore silent witness to the relentless siege that had turned a proud city into a mausoleum. It was October 1942, and the battle for the city was entering a brutal stalemate. Walls that had witnessed generations were now scarred by gunfire and shattered dreams. Fyodor moved like a ghost within the rubble, blending into the shadows cast by broken factories and burnt-out tanks. Each breath calculated, each heartbeat measured against the ticking clock of survival. Reports flooded in. Enemy snipers were claiming lives faster than replacements could arrive. These were no ordinary men. Trained at the infamous Zehlendorf school, they were lethal predators, ghosting through ruins with the precision of hunters stalking prey. But Fyodor knew how to hunt differently. His years tracking beasts in the endless Siberian forests had taught him that patience was a sharper weapon than any rifle. He had already identified the first sniper's position with a hunter's instinct. The telltale disturbance in the dust, the slight shift in shattered glass catching the fading sun. As dawn broke, Fyodor took his place in a ruined workshop, sighting down the old Mosin with iron sights worn smooth by decades of use. His breath steadied. Seconds stretched into eternity before the shot rang sharp and true. The German sniper collapsed, silenced by a bullet that found its mark with ruthless accuracy. Word spread quickly among the Soviet ranks. The old hunter was no mere relic. He was a force reshaping the deadly calculus of the Stalingrad streets. Still, the cost was clear. Each kill made him a target. The enemy would not let such a threat live long, but Fyodor embraced the shadow that now followed him. In a city where death lurked in every corner, the experienced trapper was both hunter and hunted, and he would not falter. Not yet. The war had become a chess match played on shattered streets, where every move risked death and every glance could be the last. Fyodor had earned a name among his comrades, a ghost with deadly aim, but the enemy was quick to answer. The German command sent a hunter of their own, a sniper ace whose skill was whispered like a curse among Soviet ranks. Fyodor felt the weight of the duel long before the first shot was fired. The ruined village of Matveyevo was their battleground, a patchwork of crumbled walls and scorched earth. The enemy sniper was elusive, matching patience with patience, waiting for the perfect moment. For 6 long days, they stalked each other through the ruins, two ghosts locked in a deadly game of cat and mouse. On the 7th day, under a sky heavy with smoke and the promises of winter, the moment came. Both men raised their rifles simultaneously from opposite ends of the street, their sights aligning for the instant that would change everything. 2 shots echoed like thunderclaps, merged into one terrifying sound. The enemy sniper fell headfirst into the rubble, his reign ended by a bullet as precise as the winters that shaped Fyodor. That kill marked the turning point, a message to all foes that the old hunter was no fading shadow, but a force that would bend the tide. Yet, the cost was never far from Fyodor's mind. Each victory carved scars deeper than the ones his body bore, reminders of a war that demanded everything. In the ruins of Matveyevo, as the sun set bleeding red behind broken spires, Fyodor prepared for the battles yet to come, knowing well that every duel was a promise written in blood and silence. The streets of Stalingrad were death traps, where every corner could hide a lethal surprise and every sound risked drawing fire. Fyodor had learned that the enemy was not just waiting, they were hunting. German mortar crews were soft spots in the Soviet defense, and neutralizing them became an urgent mission. For days, the mortar teams shelled Soviet positions relentlessly, inflicting heavy casualties and shattering fragile morale. Fyodor and his unit prepared for a grim game of cat and mouse. Using his hunter's instinct, Fyodor observed the patterns of enemy fire, the faint flashes of mortar launches, and the subtle tremors in the ruined buildings. He spotted signs that revealed the hidden battery's location, a tiny trail of disturbed rubble here, a shadow moving just beyond sight there. Under cover of darkness, Fyodor moved silently through the labyrinth of debris. His every sense was heightened. The murmur of distant shouting, the soft scrape of boots on stone, the faint clicking of weapons being loaded, became as clear and sharp as the cracking cold. Approaching the suspected site, he uncovered a camouflaged position where the enemy crew had nested, protected, but not invulnerable. With calm precision, Fyodor took down the first guard before he could raise the alarm. The others barely had time to react before the silence was broken by the crisp report of his Mosin Nagant. One by one, the crew fell, their deadly bombardment halted by a hunter who moved through the ruins like a shadow. The night seemed endless, but for Fyodor it was a familiar solitude, one where patience and resolve mattered more than youth or strength. By dawn, the Soviet lines were breathing easier, spared from the constant pounding. But the hunt had only sharpened the enemy's focus. They knew now that the old hunter was not just a relic, but a relentless force. A man whose every move changed the deadly calculus of war. Stalingrad was a furnace of endless battle where every inch of ground was bought with blood and iron. The city's skeleton was held together by the fierce will of men like Fyodor, whose quiet resolve was tested with every heartbeat. As October cooled into November, the fighting intensified. The soldiers dug in deeper, inhabiting cellars and ruined apartments, turning them into brutal fortresses where survival meant living as something between man and ghost. Fyodor found himself entrenched in the heart of this chaos, in a shattered factory that had become a beacon of resistance. The enemy seemed to know his every move, sending specialized hunter squads to flush him out. The night was his ally and weaver of his camouflage, but even shadows could betray. The enemy sent fresh faces, trained and eager, but none matched his cold patience and unyielding focus. Every encounter sharpened the deadly dance. Hide-and-seek played with rifles and shattered lives as stakes. One evening, footsteps echoed faintly through the basement corridors. Fyodor held his breath and waited, still as the cold concrete around him. The soft thud of boots drew nearer, a target unaware that death was waiting, steady and silent. In the grim light of a flickering candle, the shot rang true. Another hunter felled by the man who had turned the ruins of Stalingrad into his hunting grounds. It was more than a kill. It was a message. The old hunter had become a nightmare no one could escape. Yet beneath the steel resolve was a man carrying the weight of loss and the relentless echo of war. In Stalingrad's siege of shadows, Fyodor walked alone, a sentinel guarding a city built on sacrifice. The war was far from over, but so was his will to fight. The cold autumn winds that swept through Stalingrad carried whispers of a lethal game unfolding beneath the shattered skyline. It was a game of patience and precision, a deadly duel between two men whose skills transcended mere training. Fyodor, the grizzled trapper hardened by decades in the Siberian wilderness, and his adversary, the skilled German sniper ace sent specifically to take him down. For days they stalked each other through the ruins and rubble, hidden behind the bones of the city. Fyodor moved with the silence of winter snow drifting to earth, each calculated step a testament to the countless hours he'd spent tracking prey through frozen forests. The German was the opposite, a clinical killer trained in elite German sniper schools, calculating every angle, every shadow, every possible escape route that Fyodor might use. In this deadly ballet, both men used the ruined landscape as their partner, disappearing into walls, shifting through broken stairwells, their rifles the only sound breaking the silence. Friends in both camps whispered of the other's legend, but only Fyodor understood the magnitude of the threat. This fight was not just for survival, but for the strategic soul of Stalingrad itself. The turning point came at twilight on a cold November evening. Fyodor had taken position in a long-abandoned grain mill overlooking a narrow, shattered street where both Soviet and German forces moved cautiously. He knew the German was close. His instincts screamed in the silence between gunshots. Suddenly, at opposite ends of the street, two rifles rose almost simultaneously. Time seemed to freeze in the gray dusk. Then, a sharp crack echoed through the ruins. Both men fired almost together. Fyodor's shot found its mark mid-breath. The German ace fell motionless into the debris. The battle was won, but the war within the City of Shadows was far from over. Yet, the cost of victory weighed heavy in Fyodor's chest, the memory of every fallen comrade and the relentless march of war. His duel was a testament not only to his skill, but to the indomitable spirit of a man who refused to fade into history quietly. The hunter had become the hunted, and then the victor, a legend forged by courage and cold steel in the heart of Stalingrad. The city was a skeleton of ash and ruin, its shattered streets echoing with the footsteps of ghosts. In the autumn chill, as frost crept deeper into the cracked concrete, the battle for Stalingrad became a grinding siege of attrition. Fyodor had already woven himself into the fabric of this hellscape, a lone predator surviving amid crawling chaos. But the cost was heavy. Every dawn brought the sharp taste of loss. Friends and comrades fell silent, lost to the endless tide of steel and flame. In the cold, dim light of a ruined apartment, Fyodor sat with his rifle resting across his knees, the weight of the war pressing not just on his body, but deep in his soul. His thoughts drifted to the fields and forests of Yakutia, places where the cold was a companion, not a curse. There was a brutal poetry in those frozen lands, a harsh beauty he clung to in the face of destruction. Outside, distant artillery boomed like an unceasing storm, shaking the broken walls as if the earth itself threatened to open and swallow the city whole. The front was fluid, yet deadly, with neighborhood after neighborhood changing hands in vicious street battles. Fyodor moved through the rubble with silent grace, stalking not just enemy soldiers, but the creeping shadows of fatigue and despair. Despite relentless enemy pressure, Fyodor's resolve burned brighter. Every shot fired was a prayer, a defiance, a strike against the relentless tide. Hours turned to days and days to weeks as the city's fate balanced on a razor's edge. The war had become more than a battle for ground. It was a test of endurance, spirit, and the unyielding will to survive. Amidst this bleak landscape, Fyodor's presence became a symbol of unbroken strength. Though weary and scarred, he fought on, not just with rifle and bullet, but with the fierce heartbeat of a man who could not surrender. In the ruins of Stalingrad, the weight of war was unbearable, but so was the iron will of the hunter who refused to yield. The night was thick with smoke and tension when the call came. A Soviet battalion was pinned down, surrounded on three sides, battered by artillery and machine gun fire, their numbers thinning fast. The collapse of their position would mean a critical breach in the defense lines near the Volga, a foothold the enemy desperately needed. Fyodor heard the urgency in the officer's voice, a plea almost buried beneath static and desperation, but he understood immediately. This was more than a mission. It was a test of everything he had become. Moving swiftly through the labyrinth of shattered factories and broken streets, Fyodor avoided patrols and sniper nests, guided only by the flickering glow of fires and whispered Soviet communications. His Mosin Nagant was familiar weight in his hands, the cold barrel a reminder of countless hunts where a single bullet was the difference between life and death. Approaching the battalion's position, Fyodor witnessed the chaos, the wounded crying out, the command structure fraying under relentless fire, men exhausting their last reserves of courage. In that crucible, Fyodor became a silent guardian, moving through fire and shadow with deadly precision. Each shot he fired felled an enemy soldier, clearing paths for the trapped battalion to breathe and reorganize. The hours dragged on in a blur of smoke and shattered hope, until, at last, the enemy's pressure began to wane. Fyodor's presence had turned the tide. The battalion was saved from annihilation. But victory was bittersweet. For every life spared, there were scars left unseen, the quiet toll on a man who carried the weight of war like a second skin. As dawn broke over the battered city, Fyodor stood among comrades who now saw him not as an old hunter, but as a savior cloaked in silence. The war raged on, but that night, in the heart of Stalingrad, hope had found a steady pulse in the hands of a sniper who never missed. January 1943. The battle for Stalingrad had reached a fever pitch, its walls bleeding with the endless clashes of steel and will. Fyodor had become a shadow behind enemy lines, a symbol of relentless resistance in a city hanging by a thread. But this month brought more than grinding survival. It brought the first whispers of a change, a promise that the war might bend in favor of those who refused to break. The Soviet command launched Operation Ring, a massive encirclement designed to trap the battered German Sixth Army within the ruins they had once hoped to claim. Artillery thundered like the voice of a vengeful storm, slicing the winter silence as infantry surged forward through the maze of destroyed buildings. Fyodor moved through the chaos with the cold precision of a seasoned hunter, eyes sharp for movement, breaths measured beneath the frost-laden air. He redirected fields of fire, called for silent advances, and eliminated hidden threats that threatened the fragile momentum. Each enemy sniper taken was a life saved. Every observation post silenced extended a fragile lifeline for his comrades. The encirclement tightened, and as German hopes faded, desperation surfaced like a dark tide. Counterattacks bruised the Soviet lines, but the indomitable spirit of the defenders, emboldened by heroes like Fyodor, held firm. Throughout snow and blood, the city was no longer just a battlefield. It was a crucible, forging legends from the ordinary. Fyodor fought not for glory but for survival, driven by memories of lost friends and a burning will to see the war's end. As the last pockets of resistance began to collapse and the enemy commander Paul House surrendered, Fyodor stood amidst the ruins, a witness to the turning of tides. The victory was hard won, the price unimaginable, but the shadow cast by a single silhouette bearing an old Mosin was etched forever in the annals of history. The hunter had changed the fate of a city, and perhaps a world. January 1943 was a month burned into the bones of Stalingrad's defenders, a relentless torment where hope and despair clashed with every dawn. The city, reduced to ruins, was no longer just a strategic point, but a symbol, a fortress of human tenacity against overwhelming odds. Fyodor stood within this hell, his body worn but his spirit unyielding. The battles were ceaseless, the enemies desperate as their supply lines dwindled and their hope faded. In the labyrinth of broken factories, spent shell casings, and frozen blood, Fyodor's presence was a hammer striking at the enemy's core. Waves of German soldiers sought to break through, attempting to claw back territory lost in earlier counterattacks. Each incursion was met with calculated resistance, quiet shots from shadows, traps laid with lethal precision, and an old hunter's patience that would not be rushed. Communication lines were crippled, commanders struggled to coordinate amidst the chaos. Fyodor found himself acting not only as sniper, but as guide and messenger, threading through the city's guts to relay orders, bolster morale, and shield the exhausted troops through the dark nights. Each step was weighted with danger, each breath a gamble, but the pride of survival beat strong beneath the ice and dust. The final days were a blur of cold and fire. The enemy, encircled and starving, fought with the desperation of cornered wolves. Fyodor saw once proud soldiers reduced to shadowy figures clinging to ruin, their resistance cracking beneath the crushing Soviet advance. But through it all, the sniper never faltered. His shots echoed as the heartbeat of resistance amid the storm. On February 2nd, as the sun rose blood-red over the frozen Volga, the last German forces surrendered. Fyodor watched silently as columns of prisoners marched away, the weight of victory shadowed by the heavy toll paid in blood and silence. The war had carved deep into the city and into him, but it had ended. For now. In those frozen streets, Fyodor's rifle rested, but his story had etched itself into history, a testament to an indomitable will and the fierce light that can burn even in the darkest nights. The war had ended, but the echoes of Stalingrad's destruction lingered like a shadow over every ruined street and broken building. Fyodor Oklopkov, the old hunter turned sniper, stood quietly as the city began to breathe again, a fragile heartbeat emerging from beneath the rubble. His rifle, once an extension of his will, now rested silent by his side. Unlike the war's roar that had echoed through shattered walls, his victory was quieter, more profound. Fyodor's journey back to his homeland was marked by neither parades nor ceremonies, but by the gentle snowfall of Yakutia, where the winds whispered through ancient forests like around a forgotten shrine. Here, in the barren, endless white, he found solace. The forests did not judge the scars he bore, both physical and unseen, and the winds carried stories only a hunter could understand. His reputation had preceded him, a legend told in hushed tones by young soldiers who saw in his story the very essence of resilience. Despite the medals and honors bestowed quietly by a grateful nation, Fyodor remained humble. His greatest achievement was not counted in the lives he had taken, though they numbered hundreds, but in the hope he preserved for others. He had fought against despair itself, taught the young to steady their hands and hold their courage against the tide. In that, he was a guardian of light in one of history's darkest chapters. In the years that followed, Fyodor became a teacher, a keeper of knowledge passed down in lessons not found in books, but in the cold discipline of waiting, watching, and striking true. His methods shaped generations of marksmen, but it was his quiet strength, born of hardship and sharpened by loss, that became his greatest legacy. Toward the end of his days, surrounded by the vast, unyielding taiga, Fyodor reflected on the cost of war. Faces of friends lost, the weight of every shot fired, and the silence after the final battle all filled his nights. Yet, in that silence, he heard not just sorrow but defiant hope. The hope that one man's resolve could ripple through time, reminding future generations that courage is not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. Fyodor passed away quietly, leaving behind a world forever changed by the hunter who refused to surrender. His story was not just one of war, but of the enduring power of the human spirit, a beacon shining through the smoke. The old sniper's rifle now rests in a museum, but his legacy lives on in every heartbeat that refuses to yield to darkness.